On June 11, 1937, inside a secret military tribunal in Moscow, 8 of the Soviet Union's most brilliant generals stood trial for treason. At the head of this doomed group was Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, a 44-year-old military genius who had revolutionized Soviet military doctrine, a man who played violin in his spare time and spoke fluent French and German, a man whose strategic innovations would later help win World War II, but tonight he would not see tomorrow. The trial lasted mere hours. At 11:35 p.m., all 8 men were declared guilty and sentenced to death. Within 60 minutes, executioner Vasily Blokhin put a bullet in each man's head. Tukhachevsky's confession, still preserved in Soviet archives, is spattered with brown stains. Blood. His own blood. Splattered across the pages as his tortured body shook during interrogation. This was just the beginning. Over the next 2 years, Joseph Stalin would execute or imprison nearly 2/3 of his entire officer corps, systematically destroying the very men who were supposed to defend the Soviet Union from invasion. And 4 years later, when Adolf Hitler's armies crashed across the Soviet border with the largest invasion force in human history, Stalin's paranoid purge had left his military so crippled that the opening months of war became a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. 27 million Soviet citizens would die before the war ended. Stalin's paranoia hadn't just killed his generals, it had nearly killed his country. If you're finding this video valuable, please hit that like button, leave a comment below, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future videos exploring the pivotal moments that shaped our world. To understand how this catastrophe unfolded, we need to go back to 1936, when Stalin's power over the Soviet Union was reaching its terrifying peak. The purges of the Red Army didn't happen in isolation. They were part of a much larger wave of terror that swept across the entire Soviet Union, a period known as the Great Terror. But the military purge was different. It wasn't just about eliminating political rivals. It was about Stalin systematically destroying the one institution that could potentially threaten his absolute power. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky stood at the pinnacle of Soviet military innovation. Born into an impoverished noble family in 1893, he had joined the Bolsheviks after escaping from German captivity during the First World War. During the Russian Civil War, he had proven himself a ruthless and effective commander, leading the Fifth Army to defend Moscow and later crushing peasant rebellions with brutal efficiency, even using poison gas against civilians. By the 1930s, Tukhachevsky had become the Soviet Union's leading military theoretician. He developed the doctrine of deep operations, revolutionary concepts about combined arms warfare using tanks, aircraft, and mechanized infantry that were years ahead of their time. In 1935, at Bishkek, just 42 years old, he became one of the first 5 marshals of the Soviet Union, the highest rank in the Red Army. But Tukhachevsky had a problem. His superior was Kliment Voroshilov, Stalin's old friend from the Civil War. Voroshilov, despite his prestigious position as People's Commissar of Defense, lacked modern military expertise. He was a political appointee, a Stalin loyalist who had earned his position through personal connections rather than military competence. Tukhachevsky and other senior officers knew this. They knew Voroshilov was leading the Red Army toward disaster. In private conversations, these officers discussed removing Voroshilov from his post, not through conspiracy or coup, but by appealing directly to Stalin and the Politburo. This wasn't treason. This was professional soldiers trying to save their army from incompetent leadership. But Voroshilov discovered these discussions, and he understood exactly how to weaponize them. According to recent research published by the University of Chicago's Becker-Friedman Institute in 2024, based on extensive archival analysis, Voroshilov systematically used Stalin's paranoia and the services of the secret police to eliminate his critics and rivals. The study examined biographical data on 1,063 officers who held general-grade military ranks in 1936. What they found was chilling. Within 2 years, almost 2/3 of these officers were arrested. Almost half were executed. At least city generals died, including 3 of the country's 5 highest-ranked officers. The pattern was clear and deliberate. Stalin wasn't reacting to any real conspiracy. He was preemptively destroying anyone who might potentially threaten his power, and the evidence shows he specifically targeted the most competent officers. controlling for rank, age, ethnicity, and party history, the probability of being purged was significantly higher for officers who had achieved high rank at a young age, officers who had distinguished themselves in the old Imperial Russian Army, officers who demonstrated exceptional military competence. Youth combined with competence was especially dangerous. A younger officer who had reached high rank early was considered the most capable and therefore the most threatening. The mechanics of the purge were brutal and efficient. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, maintained files with potentially incriminating evidence on virtually every officer. Political statements made years ago, foreign contacts from military exchanges, ethnic backgrounds, any of these could justify an arrest. Once arrested, officers faced interrogation that often involved severe torture. Tukhachevsky's arrest came on May 2, 1937, just as he was leaving Moscow to take command of the Volga Military District, a sudden transfer that should have raised alarm bells. Secret police brought him back to Moscow in a prison van. NKVD Chief Nikolai Yezhov personally supervised his interrogation and torture. Stalin gave explicit instructions. See for yourself, but Tukhachevsky should be forced to tell everything. It's impossible he acted alone. The torture was so severe that after just 2 days, on May 26th, Tukhachevsky personally wrote a confession. I admit the existence of an anti-Soviet military Trotskyist conspiracy and that I was at the head of it. I undertake to independently state to the investigation everything related to the conspiracy, without concealing any of its participants and not a single fact or document. The confession detailed an impossible plot. Tukhachevsky claimed he had been recruited as a German agent in 1928, that he was working with Nikolai Bukharin to seize power, that he was planning to overthrow the Soviet government. None of it was true. All of it had been beaten out of him. The trial itself was a mockery of justice. 8 generals stood before a special military tribunal. One of the judges would later say, "Tomorrow I'll be put in the same place," understanding that simply participating in this trial marked him for future purging. At 11:35 that night, the verdict came down. Guilty. Death sentence. Stalin didn't even examine the transcripts. He simply said, "Agreed." Within the hour, as mentioned, they were all dead. The purge didn't stop with Tukhachevsky. It cascaded through every level of the military hierarchy like falling dominoes. According to multiple verified sources, the statistics are staggering. Of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union appointed in 1935, only 2 survived, Klement Voroshilov and Semyon Budyonny, both Stalin loyalists whose military incompetence was outweighed only by their political reliability. 15 of 16 army commanders were killed. 50 of 57 corps commanders were killed. 154 of 186 division commanders were killed. 401 of 456 colonels were killed. In total, approximately 35,000 Red Army personnel were dismissed, arrested, or executed during 1937 and 1938, with estimates suggesting around 10,000 executions. The purge hit the Navy especially hard. Admirals were suspected of exploiting opportunities for foreign contacts during port visits. 8 of 9 admirals were purged. The high command was decimated. All 16 Army commissars were removed. 25 of 28 Army Corps commissars were killed. The families of the condemned suffered too. Tukhachevsky's wife Nina was arrested and shot in 1941. His brothers Alexander and Nikolai, both military instructors, were executed. 3 of his sisters were sent to the Gulag labor camps. His 15-year-old daughter Svetlana spent years in an orphanage and then the Gulag, not released until Khrushchev's thaw in the 1950s. This was Stalin's system. Guilt by association, terror that reached beyond the convicted to destroy entire families, ensuring that fear permeated every level of society. The purge created a self-perpetuating cycle of horror. Each arrested officer's confession, extracted under torture, implicated others. These new arrests led to new confessions, which led to more arrests. The waves cascaded through the military hierarchy, extending the terror for months and years. Officers who survived the initial waves lived in constant fear, knowing the midnight knock on the door could come at any moment. The impact on military doctrine was profound. Tukhachevsky's innovative theories about deep operations, about combined arms warfare, about the use of mechanized forces, All of this fell into disuse or outright disrepute. These ideas were now tainted as counter-revolutionary, associated with executed traitors. In November 1939, the Soviet High Command abolished the 4 large tank corps that Tukhachevsky had championed, replacing them with smaller motorized divisions. This represented a retreat from the very concepts that would later prove essential for victory. The doctrinal confusion reflected both the loss of the theorists who had created these concepts and the broader uncertainty that pervaded an officer corps traumatized by purges and afraid to advocate boldly for fear of being denounced as deviationist or defeatist. Young, inexperienced officers were rapidly promoted to fill the vacated positions. Men who might have needed years to develop the necessary skills and experience were suddenly commanding divisions, armies, entire military districts. They were promoted not for competence, but for political reliability and youth, qualities that made them less threatening to Stalin's power. The culture of the officer corps changed fundamentally. Initiative became dangerous. Questioning orders became potentially fatal. Officers learned that survival meant absolute obedience, never contradicting superiors, never suggesting alternative strategies, never displaying the kind of independent thinking that wins battles. The Purge's impact became visible almost immediately. In November 1939, when Stalin ordered the invasion of Finland in what became known as the Winter War, the Red Army's performance was catastrophic. The Soviet Union deployed 450,000 troops against Finland's army of less than 250,000. The Soviets had 2,300 aircraft versus Finland's 114. They had nearly 6,000 tanks versus Finland's 32. By every measure, this should have been a quick, overwhelming victory. Stalin even commissioned Dmitry Shostakovich to compose a suite on Finnish themes, intended to be performed as Red Army marching bands paraded through Helsinki. The invasion would be complete by Stalin's 60th birthday on December 21, 1939. Instead, the Finns held out for over 3 months, inflicting severe casualties on Soviet forces. The Red Army appeared poorly equipped, poorly led, and unable to cope with Finnish terrain and winter weather. The newly promoted, inexperienced Soviet officers made tactical blunder after tactical blunder. Near 50% of experienced army officers had been executed during the 1937 Purge, and the absence of this experienced leadership showed catastrophically. Senior officers lacked the expertise to handle complex operations. The quality of the officer corps had dropped drastically, while their individual decision-making authority was crippled by the reintroduction of totally inexperienced political oversight. High command gave incompetent low-level commanders tasks which they were not educated enough to handle, nor brazen enough to take strategic liberties for better outcomes. As one Ukrainian infantryman noted in December 1939, "We're going to certain death. For every Finn you need 10 Ruskies." Soviet casualties in the Winter War exceeded 300,000 compared to around 65,000 for the Finns. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev later claimed the casualties may have been 1 million. Regardless of the exact figure, the losses were staggering and completely disproportionate to what should have been an easy victory. Finland was forced to sign the Treaty of Moscow in March 1940, ceding 11% of its territory, but the country maintained its independence. More importantly, the Red Army's dismal performance had been observed by the entire world. Adolf Hitler was watching, and he was taking notes. In planning the invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler and his generals debated the Red Army's true capabilities. According to testimony at the Nuremberg trials after the war, German Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel testified that many generals had warned Hitler not to attack the Soviets, arguing the Red Army was still a formidable force. But Hitler dismissed these concerns. He pointed directly to Stalin's purge as evidence of Soviet weakness. The first-class high-ranking officers were wiped out by Stalin in 1937, Hitler said, and the new generation cannot yet provide the brains they need. The German High Command had conducted intelligence assessments of the Red Army. They viewed it with disdain, especially because Stalin's purges of the late 1930s had removed thousands of officers. The Red Army's poor performance against Finland in 1939 and 1940 encouraged German confidence. Soviet industry was deemed incapable of producing modern weapons. German intelligence portrayed the Red Army as led by political appointees rather than professional soldiers, crippled by fear and unable to respond effectively to German tactics. On June 2, 1941, Operation Barbarossa began. More than 3.8 million Axis troops invaded the Western Soviet Union along a front nearly 100 miles long. It was the largest invasion force in human history. The Germans deployed 138 divisions, plus 36 from allied nations. The opening phase involved nearly 10 million combatants. The scale was unprecedented. The Red Army was caught completely unprepared. Stalin, despite receiving extensive intelligence warnings about the impending invasion, had refused to believe Hitler would attack while still engaged with Britain. His political calculation proved disastrously wrong. Soviet forces were poorly positioned, under strength, unable to execute coordinated defenses. The absence of experienced leadership meant that when German panzers broke through, Soviet units couldn't respond effectively. On the first day alone, the Luftwaffe shot down more than 1,000 Soviet aircraft, many destroyed on the ground before they could even take off. German forces moved with terrifying speed. The Germans began the campaign by basically destroying the Soviet Air Force, catching them completely by surprise. With air superiority established, the German army moved freely across the battlefield, thrusting deep into the Russian interior and encircling frontier armies. Soviet units that in France would have recognized encirclement and retreated found themselves instead surrounded and destroyed because their commanders lacked the experience to recognize and respond to the danger. Stalin's purges had left the army poorly led. The culture of absolute obedience meant Soviet commanders were paralyzed, unable or unwilling to make independent battlefield decisions. Officers who might have ordered tactical retreats to preserve their forces instead waited for orders from above, orders that came too late or never came at all. Stalin himself initially ordered troops not to retreat or surrender, resulting in static linear positions that German tanks easily breached, quickly cutting supply lines and surrounding entire Soviet armies. The early encirclements were catastrophic. Near Bialystok and Minsk in the opening weeks, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured. At Kiev in September 1941, 4 complete Soviet armies, the 5th, 37th, 26th, and 21st, were trapped in what became the largest encirclement in military history, netting nearly 700,000 Soviet prisoners of war. At Bryansk and Vyazma in October, another 600,000 Soviet soldiers were captured. By December 1941, the Red Army had suffered 4 million casualties. 3 million Soviet soldiers were starving in German POW camps, where most would die from exposure, starvation, disease, or deliberate mistreatment. The Germans had advanced over 600 miles, capturing vast territories including Ukraine, Belarus, and approaching the outskirts of Moscow itself. The question haunts historians. Would the Soviet Union have survived if Stalin hadn't purged his officer corps? The 2024 before University of Chicago study provides compelling evidence that the purge directly impacted the Red Army's catastrophic performance in 1941. The systematic elimination of the most competent officers meant that, when war came, the Soviet military lacked the experienced leadership necessary to respond effectively to the German onslaught. The absence of Tukhachevsky and the other innovative military theorists meant the Red Army had abandoned or forgotten the very doctrines that might have blunted the German advance. By targeting younger officers who had achieved high rank through competence rather than political connections, Stalin had eliminated precisely the kind of flexible, innovative thinking that could have adapted to the challenges of modern warfare. The culture of fear he created meant surviving officers were terrified to take initiative, to make independent decisions, to demonstrate the kind of leadership that wins battles. The final cost was almost incomprehensible. World War II losses of the Soviet Union totaled approximately 27 million people, both civilian and military, from all war-related causes. This represents by far the highest number of casualties of any nation in the war. About 8.7 million were military deaths. Nearly 19 million were civilian deaths. A quarter of the people in the Soviet Union were wounded or killed. For context, Germany suffered about 5.3 million military losses, mostly on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union's losses were 5 times higher. Not all of these deaths can be attributed directly to the purge. The scale of the war, Nazi Germany's genocidal policies, the scorched earth tactics, the siege of Leningrad, the deliberate starvation of POW, All of these contributed to the death toll, but historians largely agree that the disastrous initial phase of the war, when the Red Army was repeatedly encircled and destroyed, when millions of soldiers were captured because their officers couldn't respond effectively to German tactics, when entire armies were lost because fear prevented commanders from making independent decisions, this catastrophic opening can be traced directly back to Stalin's paranoid purge of 1937 and 1938. The purge nearly cost the Soviet Union the war. If not for the vast distances of the Soviet Union, the brutal Russian winter, the eventual arrival of American Lend-Lease aid, the incredible sacrifices of the Soviet people, and eventually the development of a new generation of capable commanders like Georgy Zhukov and Konstantin Rokossovsky, whom Stalin was eventually forced to grant greater operational latitude, the outcome might have been very different. Hitler's invasion was enabled by his observation that Stalin had crippled his own military. The first-class officers were dead. The new generation didn't have the brains yet. It took years for the Red Army to recover. Some purged officers were eventually rehabilitated and returned to service, their military expertise desperately needed. Stalin, unlike Hitler, eventually learned to grant his commanders greater operational latitude after the near catastrophe of 1941 and 1942. He increasingly deferred to capable commanders for operational decisions, though he retained ultimate strategic authority. This adaptation distinguished Stalin from Hitler, who became increasingly rigid and micromanagerial as Germany's situation deteriorated. The younger officers who had risen to replace purge victims, men like Ivan Konev and Vasily Chuikov, eventually proved themselves capable commanders. But they needed time to learn, time to develop experience, time purchased with the blood of millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians who died in the opening years of the war. The purge had inadvertently created opportunities for promotion that accelerated the advancement of a new generation, but that generation had to learn on the job, in the midst of the deadliest conflict in human history. Tukhachevsky's theories about deep operations, mechanized warfare, combined arms tactics, all the innovations that had been discarded as counter-revolutionary after his execution, were eventually revived and became the doctrine of counterattack against Germany in the latter half of the war. The very concept Stalin had condemned as treason in 1937 became the foundation for Soviet victory in 1904 and 1945. The irony is bitter. The military genius Stalin murdered in paranoid fear was the one whose ideas would ultimately save the Soviet Union. In 1957, 2 decades after his execution, Tukhachevsky was officially rehabilitated. The Soviet government acknowledged that the charges against him had been fabricated, that he had been innocent, that his confession had been extracted through torture. The brown stains on his interrogation documents were confirmed to be blood, spattered when his body was in motion during beatings. The 1960s Commission of the Presidium of the Central Committee concluded the confessions were obtained through moral and physical torture. But rehabilitation came too late. Too late for Tukhachevsky and the thousands of other officers executed in 1937 and 1938. Too late for their families, destroyed by guilt by association, and far too late for the 27 million Soviet citizens who died in a war that might have gone very differently if Stalin's paranoia hadn't gutted the military leadership that could have defended them. The Great Purge stands as one of history's most catastrophic examples of a leader destroying his own nation's ability to defend itself. Stalin's paranoia, his obsession with eliminating any potential threat to his power, his systematic targeting of competence over loyalty created the conditions for the devastating losses of 1941. Hitler invaded because he saw an opportunity created by Stalin's own actions. The best Soviet generals were dead. The new generation lacked experience. The culture of fear paralyzed initiative. Stalin survived the war. He emerged as the leader of a superpower, his control over the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe unchallenged. But that survival came at a cost almost beyond comprehension. 27 million dead, millions more wounded, traumatized, displaced, entire cities destroyed, a generation scarred by unimaginable suffering. And it all began with blood-stained confessions in a Moscow prison, with brilliant officers tortured into admitting crimes they never committed, with a paranoid dictator who feared competence more than he feared his enemies. The lesson echoes through history. A leader who destroys his own country's most capable defenders doesn't make his nation safer. He makes it vulnerable, Stalin's purge of 1937 and 1938 didn't protect the Soviet Union from conspiracy. It nearly destroyed the Soviet Union entirely. The greatest threat to Stalin's power wasn't the imagined plots of his generals, it was his own paranoia, which killed the men who could have prevented the catastrophe of 1941, which created the conditions for Hitler's invasion, which cost 27 million Soviet lives. That's the real legacy of Stalin's Great Terror, not the false confessions or the show trials. But the blood that soaked into Soviet soil when paranoia triumphed over competence, when fear triumphed over reason, when one man's need for absolute power nearly cost his nation everything.